strategic thinking is such a common skill that gets brought up as folks are making their ascension through, I see an individual contributor into management and up to the executive level is one of the most frequent asks that I'm sought out to help with is how do I become more strategic? What does that even mean? And I think coming back to the origins of strategy, it really comes back to wartime. And it's actually an exercise that I'll run with leaders who are kind of first getting into this idea of how do I become more strategic? It's just sitting down and saying, when you think of wartime, and this is the origins of strategy, what comes to mind? Like, you're a general, you're in the midst of war, what are you thinking about? And oftentimes it'll be like, I'll think about, how many troops I have, what resources, do we have ships, do we have planes, are we on the ground? I'll think about, do we have enough clothing, ammunition, food? Maybe I'll think about geographic terrain, right? Like, do we have advantages of being near the shore? Are there hills? And just really helping them to kind of flesh out this idea of there's a lot of variables at play. And as a general, you're trying to figure out what are our options to move forward.
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders. So this is a podcast for C-suites and tech decision makers to find patterns and ideas and frameworks that can be useful for them in their daily lives. As being an exec, there's lots to learn, whether it's how do I work on my day-to-day, or maybe you're an aspiring exec, and there's just lots of things that we can learn from a lot of the people that have been there before, that have been executive, that work with executives. So that's the conversation we're excited to have today. I'm really happy to have Jess Yuen on our podcast today. She's a seasoned executive coach who's got a really deep understanding of the demands and pressures that leaders face. She's really well respected. Lots of execs that I know have worked with her. She's a fantastic listener, incredibly responsive coach, and really helps folks like me and other execs and founders and leaders sort of help unlock the potential. Like, what are the things that we're not seeing? How do we think about patterns? So Jess grew up in Silicon Valley. She studied electrical engineering at Stanford and UC San Diego. She got scholarships fully paid thanks to Qualcomm. She worked in a lot of sort of critical infrastructure organizations. Her first internship was at General Atomics, which is from the General Dynamics, working on radar and muzzle flash detection. Her first job was at McKinsey in their business technology office, working with one of the largest defense contractors in the world, really helping think about IT and streamlining and how to accelerate operations. She then went on to lead product and strategy and ops in different organizations, and really ending up in this chief people officer role that's pretty exciting and so critical to so many organizations. What I find Jess is really extraordinary at is really leveraging first principle thinking, pragmatic approaches, working with executives to solve big problems. How do you navigate changing landscapes? How do you build high-performing organizations? How do you cultivate confident and impactful leaders? So all the things that are most important for running these businesses, growing them, and getting to scale. And she's worked with hundreds of global executives from Fortune 100 companies to fast-growing startups. So Jess, really excited to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you for the introduction, Ian. I'm excited to be here.
So Jess, would love for you just to take a minute and just maybe introduce yourself to the audience, the different sort of experiences that you've had that kind of led you to where you are today.
Yes, and you did such a lovely intro, Ian. I'll add on maybe just that my journey sort of started with electrical engineering. I have degrees in that. And then I threw my parents for a loop, who were so proud of an electrical engineer in their family. And I ended up going into management consulting at McKinsey, where I focused on large scale transformation, a lot in the operations and organizational space. From there, I went to Yahoo and I served in product management and their search organization. And then I started my journey through fast-changing, transformative companies. And it first started with Khan Academy in the ed tech space, and I joined the team when they were still very nascent. I was the chief of staff to their founder, Sal Khan, and then eventually took over leading their international strategy and growth at a time where at tech, it was at this transformative period of time. It was before Coursera, Udacity, Udemy, all of these wonderful organizations existed. And so I had a lot of fun there and decided to go to my next startup, which is called Gusto. And they're in the small, medium business payroll space and HR space. And so it was very meta being able to do HR for HR while I was there, and really went on with them through a really fast-paced journey where we grew more than 10x in my tenure. And then from there, became chief people officer at a company called Couchbase, which is in the enterprise database space, before starting my own company where I focus on executive coaching for leaders at fast-changing organizations.
one of the things that you're sort of an expert at, you've seen a lot around, is exec coaching. I mean, I've had exec coaches, I've had different folks that have been really transformational for me at different phases, whether it's like early stage startup or getting to scale. And I'd love to, as someone who's seen a lot of that in your work and your practice, I'd love to get, how do you think about exec coaching, the sort of like different elements, the different needs, what does that exec coaching sort of world look like?
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I feel like before you've ever had an executive coach, it feels a little bit elusive. Like, what is this magical thing that exists to help me become a better leader? And so when I first meet a prospective client, I'll actually walk them through a few things, because typically they're talking to a couple of coaches, and I want them to have an understanding of what is it that I need at this moment in time. And so the first is understanding what's the difference between coaching versus advising. There are a number of leaders who think, hey, I actually just want someone who's been there and done that and is going to tell me some of the best ways to go about it, or be a thought partner to me and as I'm leading. And that is actually more in the advising space. Coaching is much more of having somebody to help you sort of clear space and reflect on what is it that I'm taking in, what is it that I think, and helping you kind of unlock your path forward. And I tend to blend these two. So I do like to be pretty specific with my clients that I sort of sit in this magical middle of these two. But if they're looking for one or the other, that they should really find someone who excels in that space. The third piece of therapy that I bring in is just important to highlight, because there are a number of leaders who either concurrently have a therapist or have gone through therapy prior to looking into coaching. And therapists tend to be more backwards looking, of understanding how does your history, your childhood, prior work experiences play into how you show up in the present. Coaches tend to start with what's happening right now and how does that impact what you do going forward. And so there are some times where these worlds will overlap, but I do think it's helpful to understand in which ways you want to be able to leverage them. And I've certainly come forth with leaders who kind of get almost like a little mixed up of which one that they're looking for. And that makes it just having that clarity really helps people know, okay, this is what I need now, or maybe I'm exploring trying to figure out which one I need, and you might try those different modalities. The second area of coaching that I think is really helpful to understand is, do I feel like I want something more structured, or do I want something more responsive? And in the introduction of me, you'd mentioned Jess as a responsive coach. And this means when you come to a session with me, I start with often a question like, what's in your way, or what's top of mind, or what's hair on fire right now? Because that's often the thing that's like first on your mind and taking up all the brain space, or it's swirling around with all the thoughts that are happening. And so I look at my job as taking that in, meeting you where you are, and then starting to peel the layers of the onion to get to the root cause of what's going on. A more structured coach actually will have a curriculum. They'll take you into the space and say, hey, we're going to work on these handful of skills for you. We're going to learn about them, have frameworks, we're going to practice them. And then on the other end, you'll be a certain kind of leader. And typically, if you are maybe earlier in your career, you maybe haven't had formal management training, you might want to actually have that structured experience. If you tended to really love school and having an academic setting, that might be an experience that's great. But I do find the more experienced leaders, or ones who are just going through really unique or tricky situations, that responsive style tends to be a good fit. And we'll talk about in my practice where frameworks that are applicable, or where let's role play a scenario or things like that. But it's not done in such a structured manner that you'll have like a set curriculum around it or a set timeline. And that actually brings us to the third aspect of thinking about executive coaching is, do you want this to be kind of more of a timed box kind of experience, or is this like an ongoing element? And this is more philosophical. Sometimes it's, hey, I'm a new to this role or new to this organization, and I'd like to have somebody by my side for that kind of first 3 or 6 months. Or maybe over this course of the year, we're going through a major reorganization or a major acquisition or something of that nature. And you want to have a coach who's guiding you along through that evolution, and you might have kind of a set time period. There's another philosophy, which is the one that I tend to lean towards, which is, if you look at the Olympics and you see all of the athletes, every athlete has a coach. They are best in the world at what they do, but they also know, hey, having someone here who can know my strengths, know what I'm trying to focus on and get better at, be an observer for me, be a partner with me and making me better, that I can always use. And so that's the version of coaching that I look at. And so on average, my clients are working with me for over the course of multiple years. I even have clients that I work with until they retire. And so I think that is a third aspect just to think about as someone's looking into coaching or getting into it for the first time, of just, what do I do? What do I want this relationship to be?
Thank you, Jess. That's an awesome sort of summary. Please.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I was going to add is, if you've never had a coach before, one, I would say go and try it out. Most coaches will do some sort of exploratory session where you get to know them and try out. I love to wrangle a problem with somebody just so they have a sense for my style. which tends to be a little bit different than an average coach on a couple of dimensions. But there is something really magical about being completely listened to. And in a way, just having the space to allow your thoughts to be reflected and explored. And oftentimes I'll start a session and the client will begin, you know what, there's so many things that are tangled together. I'm not even sure where to start. And just helping that person kind of take that problem apart piece by piece and then build back up a plan forward it's just so, I think, liberating oftentimes for a leader to come in and feel like, oh, I don't even know what I'm going to get out of this session, and walk out and feel like I have something actionable. I feel like I can move forward. And I think the beginning processes, journaling these days is very encouraged. Meditation is something that I think is very encouraged among leaders. And I think that actually helps with the beginning of a process similar to coaching, where you're giving yourself the time and space to reflect and think about all the things that are coming at you and what's coming up for you. And coaching just takes that one step further, where you're being really pushed on the ideas that are coming up for you and how they connect back to other parts of your life.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. That's super awesome. That's a great way to sort of encapsulate it. And I'll say, like, why this conversation and getting to know you has been so exciting is I remember when I was in business school, I had almost like the opposite idea of coaching, right? Which was that, like, I didn't think I needed it. I didn't think it was very useful. And they had in business school, they had this class which was coaching. Like, there's certain classes where you have to there's a point system and there's like a lottery, and everyone wanted to get in this coaching class except for me. I'm like, why would I need coaching? Like, I don't want to be a coach. Just if you need coaching, you're just not hiring well enough. Right? Like, it's like, no, just hire people who don't need coaching, and then you can save a lot of time. And boy, was I completely wrong. And, as sort of, I think a lot of founders and CEOs and sort of people through their executive journey, coaching is one of the most high impact things. And what I actually found out, and this is what they said in business school, and like, we were like, yeah, whatever. They're like, all this like strategy stuff and like hard skills, you're going to like in the next 5 or 10 years, they're going to be a lot less useful than your like people skills and interpersonal dynamics and the touchy feely stuff. And there's a bunch of us, I came from an engineering background, to like, okay, that's for other people. Like, I just need the strategy stuff because I'm just going to like hire well. And I think that, it was really, and what I realize now is, our jobs as leaders, as executives, as managers, we are the coach, for our team as well. And you're not going to be as fully complete as an exec coach that is like perhaps the most sort of sort of sophisticated at the executive level, but we all have people that that there's going to be people who are maybe over their skis a little bit, and you got to kind of like ask them questions and let them sort of like calibrate. There's going to be people that are a little bit more sort of introverted or held back and a little more conservative, and you got to pump them up a little bit, and you have to challenge them. So I think this concept of constant coaching from us as people managers, as leaders, as CEO, is so critically important, and it's not really that familiar. And I think there's a little bit of a stigma sometimes. You kind of brought it up. It's like, wait, is coaching, is that like therapy? Like when you say it's funny because I think executives, some of them have coaches and advisors, and some of them don't. And I think the ones, and there's kind of there's sort of people that don't see the sort of full opportunity of coaching and unlocking their potential, and understanding that this time that we spend with coaches, with feedback, with someone who's really in our corner, and listening and observing, can really be transformational. So maybe one thing you and I discussed in the past, and something that I kind of notice in a lot of peer CEOs, other folks that I talk to, is there's a range, and there's people who are a little bit more extroverted and out there, and there's people who hang back a little bit, who are a little bit more analytical. And I think that the thing that we all struggle with as CEOs and leaders is how do we get those sort of more soft-spoken people who probably have like really good thinking and quality answers? How do we make the environment sort of conducive for them to share the sort of their thinking and the most important things, and not maybe be a little too far removed from the strategic conversations? I think that's something that I think I've had to deal with, other peers have had to deal with. I think you and I discussed, like, how do you sort of unlock those people that are a little bit more naturally analytical, introverted, kind of held back a little bit?
Yeah. And it's funny because I also come from an engineering background. And so this was something that I highly identified with all throughout childhood. And the term of introversion and shyness often get conflated, but I was both shy and introverted as a child, and then became an engineer where it wasn't expected that we had to talk all that much. And then I ended up in my first job in management consulting, and suddenly, like, the entire currency of are you valuable is, are you able to articulate your thoughts in real time, either in the course of the conversation or in a written form. And when I think about introverted leadership, there's actually a few things that are coming to mind. One is there's a perception amongst leaders that you need to be extroverted to succeed. that, extroverted leaders are the ones who are more naturally dynamic. They get the energy from the crowds, and so they show up in these charismatic ways. But at the end of the day, there's really introversion versus extroversion is about where do you get your energy from, but also knowing how to manage that energy. And so if you are a more introverted leader, there's an element of being able to figure out where and how do I manage that energy. And I think this is coming top of mind, and as leaders are talking about being burnt out or having to recharge or figuring out sort of how do we have resilience in the workplace. And then there's a second form of leadership when we think about introversion and extroversion that I think is where you're starting this conversation closer to, which is around introverted and extroverted thinking, which is, am I saying the things in the moment? How do I get out there? And I think that's something I have spoken to a lot of leaders about, is how do I show up in those moments? And in the early days, when I was first getting into management consulting, by the time I've processed my thoughts as an introverted thinker, the conversation has already moved on. And so how do we, right? Everybody's already 2 steps ahead. And so how do I get to that? And so some companies have come up with ways to be more inclusive. Famously for many years, Amazon used to have their 6-pager that they would have that would get sent out ahead of a meeting. Everybody would read it for the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then you would go on with the rest of the meeting, having had a chance to absorb and process. And I think sort of techniques and tactics like that within meeting structures, or just giving people materials ahead of time to review, that really allows for those who need more time to process to be able to get up to speed. And there's sections of meetings where you can even say, before just putting a question out there and expecting everybody to answer, you can say, hey, why don't we take a minute and everybody write down your thoughts to this answer, and then we'll come in to share. So just having that additional 30 seconds or a minute for people to process really can be transformational. Another example of it is at the end of meetings. I'm big on how do we improve how we're working together type of techniques. And there's a technique called fist to 5, which is at the end of the meeting, you're trying to figure out, did it go well? Was it useful? If we need it, especially if it's a recurring meeting, it's very helpful to get that feedback and try to improve it for the next time. And it's a simple exercise 0 to 5. 0 being this meeting was a total waste of time. 5 was it was so amazingly useful. Let's do it again. And then you say, hey, on a count of 3, hold out your number. 1, 2, 3. Put up a number. And then rather than everybody going around and saying their ratings, I ask this simple question: to make this meeting a 5, what would need to happen? And so then you have the few people who are peppering in with what would have taken to get to a 5. But because it becomes a ritual of sorts within organizations that practice this, people know to expect it, so they know they're thinking of it. And then also it's almost Pavlovian response is as you're putting your fist up, you're thinking, okay, what would have made this better? And I think that helps to build in a culture where it's known you're going to have a few more moments to think about what's needed. And it allows for inclusiveness. Everybody's allowed to say, because if you only have 5 minutes at the end of the meeting and then you start to just one by one have everybody talk, the time's up by the time you get to the second person and they're talking about what if they, all their different ideas. And so this way you allow everybody to put a response out and sort of prioritize how you're focused on getting the answer. So there's so many different tactics like that allow for leaders to hear from more and more of the participants in the room.
That's awesome. Fist to 5. I think I'm going to try that out. I just hope no one gives a 1.
Yeah. And if you're ever and ones are actually in some ways, this is one of those things, right? I think earlier in my career, I would have been oh my gosh, a 1 is devastating. And actually, if I got a 1 now, I would feel first, that's honesty, right? The person feels comfortable enough with you to give you a 1. That means there's some kind of trust that they trust that you're not going to retaliate against them for giving them the 1. But the other is wow, we're really off the mark. And if this meeting really isn't useful, what a waste of time and money and resources for the company. So let's actually take this as an opportunity to make it much, much better. So I think there's also reframes too, right? Of sometimes when we ask for feedback, it's do we really want it? And if we do, then how do we look at it and prepare ourselves for the outcomes that come? It's this is kind of on a different topic than introversion, but when I think about employee surveys, employee engagement surveys, this is really big in companies these days. But I used to have my teams when I was a chief people officer. Before we would ask the question, I would actually ask, okay, so there's a spectrum of what we're going to get back on this question. Either people are going to highly agree with it, they're going to be somewhere in the middle of the range, or they're going to highly disagree with it. So let's imagine those 3 courses. What are we going to do in each of those 3 scenarios? Are we going to change anything about the way we operate here? And if the answer is no, it doesn't matter what we get, we still do the same exact thing. It's why are we asking? why bother asking? Because we're not going to do anything for with the information. So when we really did genuinely ask the question, then it opens it up to say like, this is great because it either confirms we want to continue doing something, or we're going to build out a new program, or hey, we need to go back to the drawing board. It's not working and we need to go figure things out.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think the fist of five is this interesting sort of like I think it's a broader topic of like, ooh, you're going to give feedback and it's going to be like instantaneous, and it's almost like a rock paper scissors. You don't know who else is around you, so you kind of almost take a little bit of personal risk. It's and I think that is one of the most sort of important things about sort of like working is, well, how do you kind of give your true opinion, even though if it might be sort of a difficult conversation. So, so I think one is, what's the feedback about that meeting, and, how would you improve it, and how did it go? And sort of in our company, we have this likes and wishes framework, right? Like, what did you like? What do you wish? We actually got that from B school. So it's just like, don't say like pros and cons. It's like, what do I wish? It's a little bit more neutral. And then, and then it comes down to, well, how do you give the real feedback when it comes to, hey, you've got your annual reviews, you've got your one-on-ones, you've got your check-ins, how do you give feedback that's constructive and taken the right way? How do you sort of set the tone, and how do you do that in an environment that's really sort of fast moving? And there's everything from like, when you see something, like immediately give feedback, or do you kind of save it for the next one-on-one where you can be a little bit, at sort of in the right context. And definitely what you don't want to do is like hide that feedback until the annual review and like, surprise, like, here's what I've been thinking. I needed to put some stuff on the form, so I didn't tell you about it, so I could put it on the form. So I didn't run out of ideas. Those are extremes. So just talking about feedback in terms of how the meeting went, but maybe in the large. And this is a conversation a lot of managers and organizations have, which was, well, how do you think about performance calibration? How do you think about performance management? And when you think about, how do I, the hardest thing for, like, I think there's a saying, which is managers, all your time is taken with underperformance. If people performing well, it doesn't take you very much time at all. So how do you think about like identifying, hey, there's stuff that maybe it could be a little better, and how do you think about being able to train managers and executives on how to give that feedback in sort of the right way, and how to sort of categorize it, and what are the plays that you run, what are the different types? Just having been an exec coach and seen patterns in this sort of over and over again, like how would you think about, hey, there's a little bit of a wobble here, what are the categories, how do I sort of turn those around?
Yeah, I mean, what a big meaty topic, right? And I love that framework of wishes and likes. I talk about I like, I wish, I wonder as a frame, because sometimes companies use like stop, start, continue, and that works in organizations that are really comfortable being that directive. But I think in organizations that tend to lean nicer or are newer to this idea of giving and receiving feedback, I like, I wish, I wonder is an excellent entree into that, and a wonderful way to reinforce a culture that is more collaborative and wanting to be more positive oriented when it comes to this. I start maybe because I think there's so many different threads we could pull on here, right? You're bringing up feedback, you're bringing up performance management and calibration. And maybe if we start with feedback and see where that takes us in this conversation, that's a good starting ground. But with feedback, I like to lean on a definition I learned from the folks at Radical Candor, Kim Scott's company. She also has a book by that name. But it really focuses on feedback being about what are behaviors we want folks to continue doing because it's serving them, and what are behaviors that folks should maybe change or stop doing because it's not having the impact that they want to have when they're doing their work. And I think coming back, feedback is such a loaded term these days, and oftentimes leaders, employees, people in general, they hear feedback and they just think criticism, critique, like this is going to be dangerous. I now need to get into defense mode. And so elements like the wishes and wonders, or giving the definition that this is just about behaviors, what's serving you or not serving you, is trying to walk back from all of this baggage that the word feedback carries with it. But a couple of things that I would say maybe as tips or hacks around feedback that I would encourage leaders to think about. One is that the right to give feedback is predicated on the ability to receive it. So if I'm trying to give you feedback, Ian, but in the past you've given me feedback and I was like, whoa, and totally like defensive, like, no, I don't do that. And this, when I try to give you feedback, the likelihood that you're actually going to take me seriously or even care about what I'm saying is very low. And so for leaders to really open up the space for feedback to be received by their team when they're trying to say, hey, we need to do this project differently, or you missed the ball on this, if it hasn't gone in the other direction, it's much trickier to land it well. And so I would say open up the door for your team to give you feedback. But before you do that, build up some muscles around how to receive it. And one of the most critical parts of receiving feedback is actually to appreciate it. Because sometimes you disagree with the feedback and frankly, you're like, that's ridiculous. I don't do that. And I don't understand why you're telling me this right now. And I'm not going to change anything. But even if sometimes the feedback's useful, sometimes it's not, but regardless of what it is, when you're receiving feedback, it's so helpful to start with, thank you. Thank you for telling me this, because it's not easy and it's hard to bring these things up. So appreciate it and then acknowledge it. What I'm hearing you say is that, when I'm in the meeting, you feel like I use a particularly stern voice and, I'm yelling at you, and maybe that's more of a volume. I didn't think I was yelling, but I hear you. Like it sounds like it's not landing well with the team, and that's something I should be thinking about. Right. And so that acknowledgement and the appreciation for the person, recognizing that it's hard, really goes a long way. And it's also the role modeling of what you want the person to do in return, which is, hey, when I give you feedback, I also want you to notice it's not easy for me to say either. And this also makes me potentially uncomfortable. And the more that we can do that, the more we can get into a space where it feels safer and more straightforward for us to do it, because that's the expectation that we are here to help each other get better. The other thing that I would say is a hack, besides the learn how to receive it. The other hack I would say is put a little bit of context before you get into the feedback itself. So I might say to you, hey, Ian, when we had that interaction the other day, it really just didn't land well with me because, you made 2 comments that made it seem like I didn't care about the customer, right? So I might say that. But if I put a sentence in front of it, said, hey, Ian, I have some feedback for you. And this is serious because if you don't change this behavior, we're going to be having to talk about your longevity at the company in another month or 2. You're going to take that feedback really seriously. But if I said, hey, Ian, I have some feedback for you, but it's a small thing. I've noticed it. You probably didn't mean anything by it. It's not a big deal. And then I said the exact same thing. You'd be like, oh, okay. I'll think about it, but not that big a difference. And so think about the context with which you're giving this feedback. And there's actually a company that I work with that color codes their feedback. And I think this is amazing. Like in their performance reviews, they'll write up, here's all the things to be thinking about, what's going well and whatnot. And then they put colors against it. And for things that are like, you want to change or constructive feedback, that's kind of a nice to have, they color it green. For things that are kind of, it's going to become in danger if you don't fix it in this sort of, next 3 to 6 months, it's yellow. And if it's hey, you are going to lose your job if this doesn't change, it's red. And now when people are giving feedback within the organization, because they do it in their performance reviews, when it's happening at the mid-cycle or on a monthly checkup, employees will ask their managers, like, is this a red, yellow, or green? And it's created a whole vocabulary within the organization around being able to essentially have the hard conversation of like, this is serious. And it gives context around it. So when you're receiving it as an employee, like, ooh, do I need to turn this around right now? Or is this a nice to have? Okay, if I do it, this is great. And I might still change my behavior the same way, but I at least understand the gravity of what the feedback is.
That's amazing. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So what I thought I heard you say is it's really, appreciating feedback, really setting the context, making it reciprocal. How do you have a culture that understands, the different context, and, how explicit can you be on how important this feedback is? Wow. I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, so I'm learning something here. I don't know. I'll have to think a little bit about how we might, or how we think about that context. But I think as I'm just listening to you, there's like, wow, I think people might hear feedback and take it completely different ways. The manager or the peer even. Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay.
And it's one of those things like, we all kind of expect people to know that context, right? Like as a leader, we're almost like, how can they not see how serious this is? Or why do I need to be so explicit? Like they know. And the thing is, even when they do know, it's nice to have extra clarity on it, but most of the time people don't. It's kind of, have you ever played this game where you clap out a song and the other person has to guess what song you're clapping?
I'm terrible at that game, but yes.
It's hard, right? Like usually people will pick like Happy Birthday or Jingle Bells or something to start. And then once you get past those first couple of like really obvious choices, it's extremely hard. And part of what makes it so hard is in the person's head who's clapping, they hear all of this other like symphony of sound, right? Like they hear, lyrics going, they hear all of these instruments that are happening, but all you hear as the receiver is just the clapping. And when we're communicating with people, and especially when it's feedback, that's what's happening. Like what's coming out of your mouth is like clapping to the other person. And in your head, you're thinking of all of the times where the person displayed this and all of, and we're just doing our best to convey that through words. But I like to bring that up because it's that extra context that really helps to give the color and helps the person guess at what you're trying to get at the end of the day. And the less guessing they need to do, the more we can be explicit about it, the easier it is for us as leaders to be able to have a conversation. And I was just talking to a client yesterday, and they've started doing a version. They've adapted a version of the Netflix keeper test and trying to figure out, who would they actually fight for to keep within the organization. And this leader said, I actually was really explicit with somebody on my team. And I said, hey, you know what? You're knocking it out of the ballpark right now. And here's like 4 or 5 things that you're doing very specifically around it. And, if I were asked the keeper test today, you definitely pass it. And then followed it up with, but 2 months ago, I actually wouldn't have been able to say that. And here's what was different about 2 months ago. And here's what I see from you. And and this leader said to me, like, it opened up this incredible level of trust and understanding between us about what we're looking for in his performance and what's the expectation going forward that I don't think we would have been able to get to otherwise. And so, for every company, it's different, right? Like the keeper test doesn't work for every organization. This red, yellow, green coloring of performance isn't everybody's cup of tea. And that's totally fine. But at the end of the day, you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we really communicate clearly and giving all of the color of that full song of what we're trying to convey?
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. Can you just maybe for the folks that are a little bit, can you say a little bit more about the Netflix keeper test? Like, how do you sort of, do you see do you see Netflix keeper test and maybe explain a little more context on it? Is that something that you think about as sort of like a norm that like there's different variations of it, right? So I've heard ones which is, well, if this person said they're going to quit, how hard would you fight for them? There's other ones which is, well, this person, if we opened up a search for this role, would this person be a hell yes, hire into that role? So there's going to be sort of different variations. Do you see that's like kind of, different across all the different companies, or do you find there's sort of like these like buckets about the keeper test that people run into? Like, what do you see in that question?
Yeah, I think what resonates with people around this keeper test, which is just pushing managers to ask themselves in a right now moment, like if I wanted, if this person wanted to leave right now, would I be fighting to keep them? Or, knowing everything I know about them, would I choose to hire them again? It's really trying to bring to a point of, is this person actually still valuable, or are they just here because, it's almost sunk cost to a degree, or it's easier to just not deal with it than, make a decision. And there are different flavors that I see in companies. There's one company, Athena, that I work with, and their VP of people actually asks a version of this where it's, if you could replace this person today with a snap of your fingers, would you? Sort of taking out all the friction that usually is the reason why people don't replace somebody. But if you could do it with a snap of your fingers, would you do it? She has 3 questions. So that's the first. The second one is, if we had to reduce headcount, is this somebody you would go to bat for? Right? So if in the light of the last 18 months, 2 years, 3 years for some businesses, we've been having really hard conversations around headcount. So does this person make the cut from that standpoint? And then the third one, the version she asks is this person creating net more opportunities for the company or draining resources? And I've heard variations of this, something like, does this person make it seem like there's more work to do or less? Or after interacting with this person, do you have more energy or less energy? But all of that's trying to bring into kind of focus for a leader of, is this person actually doing what we need them to do? And, it's complicated right now because there's all of this other stuff that they're connected to. But if we remove that, is the right decision actually to have them here or not have them here?
Yeah, that is a focusing question. So we've talked a little bit about underperformance, and I think that those difficult conversations are really important, so that people have transparency and understanding of where things are and how things stand. I think that, and the underperformance stuff is difficult. At the same time, I've also talked to leaders where you kind of have the opposite problem of high potential people, right? And they're like, okay, great, they're high potential. I'm not going to care about them. They're just going to run on their own. And sometimes you actually have the most opportunity with the high performers and unlocking their capabilities to do more and unlocking their career paths. So when you think about that flip side of the question, which is like, okay, if I'm spending all my time on underperformance and trying to coach up and try to turn things around, can you share a little bit about the high performers and how to, in the performance calibrations, as you fill out their performance review or reflect, whether it's quarterly or biannually, sometimes what happens is, this person's a high performer. Let me just fill in some, random, material, like go read these books or go take a training course. And how do we get beyond that sort of more sort of like administrative, not really thinking about it feedback for high performers and leaving them sort of as they are, to recognizing the potential, the motivation and the skill set in these top people and really unlocking that as a leader, as a manager? Like, how do you think about performance management for the top the very top people at the company?
That's such a good question around performance. And it's bringing up a couple of things. I think one is with high performers, you had mentioned earlier, is sometimes leaders are spending an inordinate amount of time on their low performers. And I would argue you should be spending an inordinate amount of time on making sure your high achievers are most engaged and most optimized, because at the end of the day, a company exists to try to achieve certain business goals, and people are there to help get you there. And so if you're not optimizing your people, they're the most expensive line item in the budget. We're really then doing a disservice to both, like, for those who are empathetic leaders, we're doing a disservice to people feeling like they're doing their best work. And for those who are more like financially oriented, business oriented leaders, you're also doing a disservice to actually optimizing the resources that you have in the organization. And so either type of leader that you are and what you're thinking about, you really want to make sure that when you have high performers, not only are you identifying them, but you're also engaging them. And so to your point, like having them read some books, maybe get a mentor, like those are great as helping them learn or to start learning skills. But the real thing comes into practice is how do we take them, especially for 10x high performers, how do we really allow them to give them 10x back to the organization? And in today's day and age, especially with AI and all of the applications that are coming forth, the question is not even about 10x performers, but we're going to start having 100x and 1000x performers. And so you really want to make sure that they are engaged. So I'm seeing companies that are being quite thoughtful in the way that they're structuring and figuring out projects to have these folks aligned to. And sometimes it's within the context of their day-to-day job and just making sure that they're either getting more responsibility or bigger scope. But in other places, it's actually, hey, their strengths are in a place where it's outsized cross-functional sort of initiatives or an ability to work on something brand new for the organization. But I would say, don't just put anybody anywhere. Like, really understand what their strengths are, really understand what are the skills and needs of the company to be able to achieve its goals, and then try to align those, because that's where you're really unlocking their potential. I think that the challenge, though, with high performance, two parts to it. One is performance often ebbs and flows over time. And so while there are the performers who forever are high performers and they're amazing and everybody wants them, many people find that there's some parts of their career where they're like really knocking it out of the ballpark, and other parts of their career that maybe they're struggling, or they're learning a new skill and it's really hard, or they just stepped into a new role and they're a fish out of water for a while. And so I would say, as we think about high performance, there is an element of how do we account for those ebbs and flows over the time? And when we think about the individuals in it, how do we help support at those transition points or those places where it does get more tricky in a way that can be meaningful, whether it's a manager getting closer to the work or getting an extra, mentor or set of, training, or a coach that comes into play. But I think that's the question of how do we really allow this person to grow, but within the context of business needs. The other second tricky part about performance is we use these terms of high performance and low performance as if it's obvious when we have them. And there is, at the extremes, there's like the low performer who like never shows up to work or is always late or misses every single deadline and is a total jerk to work with. Those are the easy cases of low performance, right? Or the high performer is the one who's always doing well. But most performance is tricky and falls somewhere in between, where maybe they're inconsistent, and on one project they're amazing, and on the next project they're like meh, and maybe even negative value add. And you're trying to figure out, what do I do with this inconsistency? Underperformance masks itself in many different forms like this. And actually, Melanie, the VP at Athena I mentioned earlier, who does the red, yellow, green, she has these wonderful names for sort of these kind of personas. And so one is that inconsistent yo-yo performer. It's like, are they high or are they low? I don't know. There's the brilliant asshole. They're bringing in tons of revenue, but they're a jerk to work with and nobody wants to work with them. Do we keep them around? Because they're definitely not culture carrier, but they're great for the bottom line. So what do we think about that? Is that high performance or low performance? There's the person who tries too hard, where maybe they're nice, but like there's a lot of effort, but not a lot of impact. There's the drama king or drama queen, where they're just, as she calls it, part of my language, but like the shit stirring venter, where they're like venting to everybody about everything that's wrong. And they're just, kind of magnifying problems, whether they are actual problems or not. There's the person who's the Lego hoarder, who's kind of just almost kingdom building and elbowing their way to kind of collect more and more Legos in the organization. And then the last persona that she has for these kind of low performance, underperformance masks is the not my problem loner. Like, it's not my job, I'm not helping you out, like, leave me alone. And I think all of these different masks are helpful to identify, and not every company has tons of them, or even maybe there's certain flavors that resonate more for your organization or versus another. But I think it is helpful to define for our company when we talk about high performance or medium performance or low performance, what do we really mean? And so, for example, at Gusto, we actually would define ratings and we didn't roll it up into one. We actually had like what you're doing, like how much impact were you having to a company, and then how you were doing it, which was like how much was this aligned to the values of the organization, what you're like, the way that it was expected that you were going to be approaching your work within the context of your department or your role. And I think that really helped to pull out some of these tricky cases. And then at the end of the day, we were looking at more on a 2x2 or 3x3 type of matrix, which I think is what many companies end up doing, but they have slightly different dimensions they're focused on. But I think illuminating that conversation around what do we believe around performance at the end of the day, what really makes it okay or not okay here is really, really valuable. And the thing I'll add is this year I've heard so many companies talking about we have high performance culture and we expect everybody to be high performance. And there was an employee I was talking to in passing, and his CEO had gotten up at the last company all hands and had said, we need everybody working as hard on Friday as they do on Tuesdays. And insinuating like we need everybody to be working much, much harder to be this high performance company that we need to be. And the employee said to me, what went through my mind when I heard that I need to work as hard on Friday as I do on Tuesdays was, yeah, I am working as hard on Fridays as I am on Tuesdays. I don't work very hard on either of those days, and it's just sort of typifying. At the end of the day, you try really hard as a leader to kind of figure out how to motivate and encourage. But if we're not defining what it means to work hard or be a high performer, or what the metrics are that you're going to be measured on at the end of the day, employees will interpret in a lot of different ways. And I even saw this at a leadership training that I was running, and I had founder CEOs from a number of organizations in the room. And I started the conversation off with, when you think high performance culture, how do you define it? And one said, oh, it's about getting the most out of your people. And another said, it's about, beating the goals that we have written down. And another one said, no, it's about speed. Speed is the thing that we care about. And that means we're high performance culture. And the room kept peppering with more answers. And the thing that became really clear was like, everyone defines this differently. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong or that it isn't high performance. It's just for every organization, it is different. And when I asked how many of you have actually sat down and defined what high performance means for your company and what a high performance culture is and what behaviors exhibit that, nobody had actually done that. And I think that's what comes back to, like, when we think about performance and all of this stuff, it's a loaded term. There's a lot around it. And so sitting down to define it is really a great foundational starting place to be able to then build on top of it and allow your company to then understand, okay, this is what they're expecting of me, and this is how I'm going to be measured on it, and these are the behaviors that align to it.
That's awesome. That's very comprehensive. There's and you talked about a lot of things there. Maybe we can kind of go back. So there's a lot, and I think maybe I'd love just double click. I mean, I love this conversation because I learn a lot from sort of different perspectives, and I kind of wonder what I think I would know what I would say if I was in that room. We have this book, Output Management by Andy Grove, and they actually have like a formula for like output, which is the output of the manager's organization plus the organizations they influence. So it's really just a reminder for me to go and emphasize that to our managers. When you think about however you define performance and define output, you brought up a system that a lot of different companies use, which is how do you think of that sort of 9 box that, like, okay, what's the top, middle, and bottom for performance, and what's the top, middle, bottom for potential? And this is, if you kind of Google 9 box, a lot of organizations are doing this a little bit more explicitly. And I'm kind of curious, having been a chief people officer, having worked with leaders and executives, what you've seen in terms of that sort of calibration exercise. Like, okay, if we're going to say top, middle, bottom third, and the frameworks, like how do you sort of manage that? Because do you do it by sort of level of the different employees, about sort of job title buckets? Do you do it in the absolute terms? What are sort of different approaches you've seen? What are sort of the pros and cons of having sort of calibration discussions? Some of this has been in the news. I'm just kind of curious, what have you seen that works well and maybe doesn't work as well?
Yeah, I think what gets tricky with calibration discussions is I remember talking to an executive at Meta, and a performance management season is happening, and they do calibrations at every single level. And so this person was like, I am just in calibration discussions for the next 3 weeks, and I don't know what I'm going to do the rest of my work. And I think that's when we talk about performance management season and evaluations and calibrations, like the time consuming nature of it often makes many leaders go, oh, like, oh, I have to write up these things and it's going to take forever. And like, it's all in service of trying to help everybody work better. But if it's sort of overpowering the fact that you can actually get your work done, I think it requires, hey, let's take a look at what's working for us and what do we need to come back to. And so I do think calibrations are really useful, because what it's helping to do is make sure, and I've been in a room when this has happened, like one manager rated everybody the absolute top rating because they're just more of that cheerleader type of leader. And another manager has rated their team like much more middle of the road because they're much harsher of a grader on that standpoint. And having the conversation about, hey, here are the characteristics or skills that we're looking for in team members of this nature. So I do think having some kind of closeness in the job roles and job functions that you're talking about is helpful. When I've worked with, fast growing startups, when it's early stage and you've got, a couple hundred people, you can typically do the entire company more holistically, even though it's quite disparate because it's a small enough group. As you get larger and larger, you start to, pull out technical roles versus business roles versus kind of more ops or administrative roles. And then when you get to much, much larger organizations, it gets more and more defined. And so I think the piece that we want to pull at the end of the day is calibrations exist because we want employees to understand that the process is fair, that it's not just the luck of the draw on which manager you have. If you have the cheerleader, like you end up with this manager and you get lots and lots of promotions. You end up with that manager, sorry, you're stuck at this level forever and ever. And so I think that pulling through that fairness thread at the end of the day is what we're trying to solve for. And the sort of the 2x2 or 3x3, the dimensions that we're looking at the end of the day, for many, many years has been potential and performance. And I think the conversation that's interesting I'm hearing now is, for as many companies that still use that, tried and true, there is a question of potential. How do you really evaluate it? How subjective is that? How biased is that? And so I do see more and more companies moving to a version of what we had been doing a decade ago at Gusto, of this like what versus how, like the business impact versus the kind of how you approach your work, if your values aligned, more of that discussion that's more focused on the right now. I think the other thing that's interesting that I'm seeing happening in the performance discussion space is this idea of, rather than it being good performance versus not good performance, some companies are looking at it like skill building and a way of helping employees get to mastery. And this is something that reminds me a lot of when I was at Khan Academy. We talked about kids learning skills or students learning skills. We would talk about whether you were at the beginning of learning that skill and more of a novice, or if you were starting to get more practiced, or if you were becoming more of an expert and then becoming a master. And I've seen some companies actually adopt this, where their ratings are not like meets expectations, exceeds expectations. It's more like, hey, you're a novice on these skills. You're getting practice on these skills. You've gotten to mastery on those. And for this level and this role, here's the expectation and how you align to it. So I think that has been an interesting evolution to see, that it's more about the learning and less about an evaluative good or bad. And then maybe the last thing I'll throw in there is kind of an interesting food for thought. I've seen a few companies that have been focusing more and more on team calibration. And there's different versions of how team calibration has happened. But one version that I thought was particularly fascinating was a company where they actually asked all of their leaders to rate like the top 3 teams or departments in the organization and the bottom 3. And then they compared. And you also self-evaluated where you thought your own team was in that as well. And so then they were able to have these conversations like, hey, marketing team, sorry to pick on marketing, but like marketing team, like you rated yourself as like a most amazing top 3 team in the whole organization, but actually you made it into more than half of every other leader's bottom 3. So there's a disconnect of what you think you're doing and how you're serving the other organizations that rely on you and need you. Now let's actually look at that. And so that element helped with both cross-team collaboration and effectiveness, because it was taking the conversation to a different level. But it also helped with the individual performance ratings, because then you looked and saw, hey, the marketing leader was a cheerleader type of evaluator, and everybody had gotten the top rating. It's like, can we really give everybody the top rating if they're not actually seen organization-wide as a top team? And so I think that sort of team level calibration, and I've seen a few different variants of it, but that level of conversation, I think at the end of the day has been really fascinating, because managers are leading teams. And while individual players are important, you can get together a bunch of A players and have a B or C team. And I think that's actually a really important element to evaluate our leadership on too.
Oh wow, there's a ton to unpack there. So thank you. So team level calibration. Okay. So there's a wow. Let me just kind of double click on a few things I've been thinking about as you kind of shared those. I was, the sort of, I think at Gusto you mentioned there's sort of like a sort of an outcomes and a behavior kind of dimension. And at first I was thinking about like, what does that mean? Like, why would you care about behaviors if the outcomes, like in what situation? And then I kind of realized, for sales, that's actually a really good, like I realized we do that as well, which is like we have a salesperson that maybe had, a bad patch, or maybe some things didn't happen kind of the right way, and output is maybe a little low, but their behaviors in terms of discovery and prospecting and all these different behaviors were really strong. And how do you rate that against maybe another individual who didn't really have the right behaviors, but got a couple very sort of some of the business comes from the territory. So I can think of sales as like one of the examples where we've got behavior and outcomes that should really be separated. I'm just kind of curious thinking about like, well, what are other examples? Because I think about like, well, does that apply to engineering? Because like, if you're building good code, is performance and behavior kind of the same? It's scales, it's low defect count. What I can think of sales as outcome and behaviors need to be separated. What are some other examples? I'm just trying to picture it in my head.
Yeah, and I would go back to, for most companies, it's what are your values and what behaviors are you trying to encourage amongst your employees. So, for example, if we go with Gusto, the engineering team was actually really big on collaboration. Like even in the interview process, you would do a pair programming interview where you would actually sit down with an engineer on the team and like program together some part of the code. And that's actually something that you would do in your day job if you became a full-time engineer there. And so collaboration was actually a really important aspect, that you couldn't just be sort of the lone engineer doing their amazing code on the side, but it actually needed to be in the context of team and how you were helping other people. And if you saw something that was going awry, that you were kind of stepping in and proactively helping to solve it. And so it was encouraging of those types of behaviors of the how. It's not just about the what. And I think this comes back to that mask type of underperformance of the brilliant asshole. Is like, we have them, but do we say that that's okay at our organization? And I think for some companies, frankly, they'll hear me talk about this and be like, we actually don't care about the how. We only care about the what. The output is the only thing that matters, and this is ridiculous and it doesn't apply to us. And you know what? Fair. I mean, that's your organization and that's what is working for you. And I think all of this, when we look at how do we evaluate performance, what are we giving feedback on, where is it applicable, is going to come back down to what is the type of organization that we are and that we're trying to create. And I talk a lot about the word culture because we talk about the idea of company culture a lot, right? It's this like magical, unspoken potion that exists. And I just come back to a definition. It's a dictionary definition of culture, which is the words, actions, and behaviors of a group of people. And in companies, it's fascinating because your group of people is always changing. You're almost always either hiring or firing or saying goodbye to somebody. And so that inherently change and culture, it goes hand in hand. But the words, actions, and behaviors, like values are just a version of words. Performance management is a version of trying to say, here are the actions and behaviors that we're rewarding or recognizing. And so all of the things that we're either explicitly or sometimes implicitly saying are okay in our culture, those are the elements that we're just thinking, okay, this gets magnified. Is that all right? And so if you have the salesperson or the engineer who is just like, I am an island, this is my kingdom, I can treat people however, like peons over here. Like if we say we don't evaluate on it, we don't give feedback on it, we're saying that's okay. And that's encouraged, and that we want more of that essentially in the organization. And other people will look and say, oh, that person, that salesperson who's, kind of being a jerk to everybody else, you know what? They're going to President's Club and they just got a raise and a promotion. Whew, okay, I'm going to be more of a jerk too if I want to stay here and succeed. And I think that's the part of it that we want to understand and be intentional about as leaders is maybe we do want more of that. I don't know your company, maybe you do. But if you don't, then it's how do we actually intervene and interject? And performance management is just one version of creating structure around that interjection. It's not the only way, and it doesn't have to be a way if that's how you want your company to run. But I think that's what's so complex and fascinating about company cultures is there isn't one right way to do it. And even when you hear ideas, what I love, Ian, about you is like, you'll hear an idea and you'll be like, that would work for Mattermost, or, ooh, I don't think that's my cup of tea. And that's totally fine, right? Like, cause it's legit.
Yeah, thank you. That's totally right. I mean, there's lots of ideas that I'm kind of having, and I'm like, ooh, that might be a little too spicy, and this might be a little more like, this might be a little bit more fitting with our culture. That might, and who knows? The management team is, potentially going to watch this and be like, no, we want that. So we'll see. Maybe just one quick follow up. I have so many questions, but maybe just one quick follow up. When you think about the calibration and you think about the different flavors of underperformance, I think one thing that some people struggle with is that yo-yo inconsistency, archetype that you discussed. Because, can you share just like, well, how do you categorize that yo-yo inconsistency? Sometimes they're like, amazing, and sometimes they're a little bit off. How do you think about like, well, there's sometimes I would, in that sort of, Netflix test, sometimes I would dive and catch, sometimes I wouldn't. So how do you think about that inconsistent yo-yo profile?
I mean, it's such a good question, right? When I think about inconsistency, I usually start with trying to understand what's happening for the employee that they've yo-yoed away from being a great performer. And sometimes it's things that's happening in their life, like they're suddenly caretaking for a parent who's sick. They might be going through a divorce. I've actually seen this happen where there was one leader I was working with, somebody on his team was going through a divorce, and they actually had a very explicit conversation around, you know what, this quarter, maybe even next quarter, you're not going to be performing well because you're going through this was a bitter experience. And that's okay. But I'm letting you know right now, you're not going to get a great rating, but we're going to see you through on the other end of it. And I thought that was actually a really incredible display of directness around the fact that that was happening. So the first thing I do is try to understand why. And if we can understand why, is it temporal? Is this long term? Is it something that the company can help support the employee through in a way that makes sense in line with the organization's values and structures? Right. And then it then becomes a question of how long do we allow for this to happen. So like sales teams are really usually very clear about it, right? Like if you miss your quota for one quarter or two quarters or three quarters in a row, then that means you're being terminated. And I think that level of clarity for an organization is helpful when they're looking at an inconsistent yo-yo. At the end of the day, as a manager, you can have the conversation, or as a leader, you can have the conversation to sit down and say, you I'm noticing that there has been inconsistency. And the expectation for this role is that we can get to a version of consistency. And my hope is that we can practice this and get to a place for the coming quarter. By the end of this quarter, or in the coming quarter, right? So you set a time frame of when the expectation of when consistency is supposed to happen. Do you think we can get there? Let's come up with a plan. And so you almost have this first figuring out why is this happening, second figuring out what's our tolerance time wise to see change happen in, and then being really clear with the employee about what the company's expectation or the team's expectation is around getting to a level of consistency. And what I'll follow this on with also is very applicable to people who are on pips and kind of move their way back out of it is, what's the expectation if it falters again? Like say they get to a quarter of consistency and it's like everything seems to be great, and then the quarter after that it falters and you're like, shoot, do we repeat? Are we okay with repeating this? And that's part of the conversation that needs to be had, I think, up front of, and if this happens again, here's the consequence, or here's what the path forward looks like. In some companies, it's you'll have another chance and we'll get you on track, but then there's no more. Or sometimes it's an immediate, like the minute we see it falter again, that's it. And so I think creating a path with that level of clarity of not only if you succeed, but also if you succeed and then we see it come back down again, here's what it looks like, I think is a very lovely, like lovely is probably too nice of a word, but it's clarity. At the end of the day, it's clarity and providing actually in a place where you're seeing inconsistency on performance, you're trying to create consistency on the expectations relative to the performance.
Yep, thank you. That totally makes sense. I mean, that's one of the hardest things. And I think you've broken it down really well. So, one of the things that we kind of talked about is this kind of notion of sort of frameworks and strategic thinking, and your background at McKinsey, a little bit in defense, on the hardware side to chief people officer. There's a lot of sort of different frameworks and approaches that I think, you and I have discussed kind of in the past. And, one of the things that, I spent a little time on is sort of the defense and sort of security industry. And you can see a lot of sort of strategic thinking in the sort of the large nation state, really sort of high stakes sort of strategy. And I'm just kind of curious, like in your different experiences, how do you think about strategy for these executives and that you coach and you've worked with in the past? Like, how do you think about, well, of all the different things going on, we talked about the soft side and the people and the things that are a little more difficult to measure. When you think about frameworks around sort of strategic thinking, what kind of comes to mind for some of the conversations you had around these sort of apex leaders?
Yeah, strategic thinking is such a common skill that gets brought up as folks are making their ascension through, I see an individual contributor into management and up to the executive level is one of the most frequent asks that I'm sought out to help with is how do I become more strategic? What does that even mean? And I think coming back to the origins of strategy, it really comes back to wartime. And it's actually an exercise that I'll run with leaders who are kind of first getting into this idea of how do I become more strategic? It's just sitting down and saying, when you think of wartime, and this is the origins of strategy, what comes to mind? Like you're a general, you're in the midst of war, what are you thinking about? And oftentimes it'll be like, I'll think about, how many troops I have, what resources, do we have ships, do we have planes, are we on the ground? I'll think about, do we have enough clothing, ammunition, food? Maybe I'll think about geographic terrain, right? Like, do we have advantages of being near the shore? Are there hills? And just really helping them to kind of flesh out this idea of there's a lot of variables at play. And as a general, you're trying to figure out what are our options to move forward. And I think sometimes there's a controversial view of like is strategy and planning and how similar they are. And for me, I try to simplify it and say strategy is a version of planning. Like you're trying to figure out how to move forward and plan ahead of what's going on, but you're taking into consideration that there's all of these variables that are at play. You don't know exactly what your enemy's going to do or what they have, and so you're anticipating. And so there's two hacks when it comes to becoming a more strategic leader that I will introduce to help build these muscles for the clients that I work with. One is on time and just thinking, how far ahead do you comfortably think out? And for some leaders, it's, I think like 1 quarter out. I know exactly what we're doing this quarter. There's a lot of clarity. Next quarter is a little fuzzy, but we can get there. And so for them, I say, hey, instead of thinking out 1 quarter, let's think out 2 or 3 at a time. For the leader who thinks in like 6 months increments, it's 12 to 18 months. For somebody who thinks annually, it's 2 to 3 years. And the extension of time really is just helping to see around the corner of like, what's the thing that if I just gave it a few minutes, I would be like, of course next year we're thinking about that. But right now I'm too busy, so I'm not putting any thought into it. But in the war, the war example, this is maybe we're in the midst of summer right now, and we're thinking that this battle is going to end before, the war is going to end before we hit the end of the summer. So I'm not thinking further out than that. But what if I just do if I need a backup plan, if it doesn't end by the end of summer and we do extend 6 months, we're in the middle of winter and there's snow, what does that look like? And if we just take a few minutes to think about what's that backup plan, in that case, it leads us down a whole other path. And for those of us who studied any history, we know there have been wars that have been lost based off of the fact that we didn't anticipate needing to go into wintertime and all of the things that came with it. And so in the corporate world, it's thinking ahead, that, extra time period and going, what's the thing that I'm not thinking about that maybe I should put more effort into? Last year at this time, I would say AI was on everybody's mind of, how does it fit into our plan? If we look ahead at the rate that it's exponentially growing, we're trying to figure out, is this a little thing? Do we start experimenting? Does this need a big thing in our product? And so I would encourage that as like the first hack of just think a little further out, see what comes up for you and your team, and then fold it into your plans of what do we need to do now to be able to prepare for it. The second hack that I talk about with leaders is just how to level up. And so kind of the visual that I think about is, you might be the mayor of a neighborhood, and you're seeing who cut their lawn, and the cars are moving back and forth across the street brilliantly, and this person goes to work on time every single day. But if you go maybe to the top of the second story or maybe on your roof and you look across the neighborhood a little bit more, you might actually realize, that there's a traffic jam that's starting up over there, and so that person who thinks they're on time is actually not on time, and there's a water main that just broke, and so that water's flooding, and that nicely cut lawn is not going to look so nice in a little bit. And so you start to see as you move up a level, there's different challenges that are ahead. And maybe you get into an airplane, and further yet you see broader, and you might see, oh my gosh, it's really green in this patch over here for everybody's lawn, but it's actually yellow everywhere else. What's happening? And so the version that you want to get to is, how do I level up when it comes to my company? So a couple weeks ago, I was talking to a CEO. He's having challenges with his board, and the next board meeting is coming up. And so we were talking about how is he preparing for it. And so he walked me through how his team usually prepares. They start by taking last month's deck, they empty it out, they throw in all the data of right now, then it goes through a couple of rounds, and then somewhere 3/4 of the way down, the CEO takes a look at it and starts to put in, his thoughts. And I said, well, what if we stepped up a level and without any data that like your team needs to put together, but knowing what you know now about your company, what are the 5 things you need your board to understand about this organization and the plans ahead and how you're mitigating risks? What's the story you're trying to tell them in this next quarterly board update? And so we sat down and he said, well, actually, and he spit out a bunch of things about how revenue is going and they're doing an acquisition and all of this. And I said, okay, great. And then we fleshed that out into a storyline. We sent it to his team. Then they put in supporting data and it just transformed because we took that level up. And instead of starting at ground level and bottoms up building of it, instead we started from the airplane and then looked down about what's going on in his organization. It totally turned around how he was going to be approaching his board and being able to talk about that. So that's the level up that I'll do with leaders where it's, hey, let's just take a step back. And it's really tough when you're in the thick of it to be able to do it. So it's figuring out what are the hacks around being able to take that higher level view. And for some leaders, it's, you'll go to an industry conference or you'll get inspiration from talking to other leaders. Sometimes it's internally, you'll get that insight. Sometimes it's just having that space to be cleared or working with a coach. But wherever and however you have it, I think the ability to give yourself the time, space, resources to be able to be more strategic really can transform how you're approaching things and clear the way. I was talking to a CEO yesterday and we were reflecting on the work we've done together. And he said, what's amazing is, not only have I learned how to delegate better and be a better leader and all of this, he's like, I have more time. Like, it's weird. I have more time for things than I used to prior. And I think when you bring in that strategy to be able to step out of the thick of it, it does allow you to kind of see things differently, manage your time and priorities differently.
Excellent. Thank you, Jess. That was hugely helpful. I think, I think everyone does want to get more strategic from the IC to the manager. And that concept of, hey, think a little bit longer and think a little higher level is a really excellent direction. And I do agree that does give us a lot more time when we can level up when, in our organizations, different folks, high performers, and we can have them think out a little higher, a little longer. It is such a transformational unlock for a lot of folks. So Jess, really want to appreciate you for your time and sharing. What are the best ways to sort of reach you online on sort of social media or other avenues?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn and I also have a website, Jess Yuen at jessyuen.com. And then you're welcome to email me at jess@jessyuen.com as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. We'll put those in the show notes. Really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.